All right, so my presentation is going to be about web accessibility, which is a very important element to web design. And it's something we actually are already kind of familiar with in this class. All right, so what exactly is web accessibility? Web accessibility is when websites are designed in such a way to where people with disabilities can use them, and also people who may have difficulty using devices or um, limited internet access, possibly. So, why web accessibility? Why do we use it? So, orienting our site design around accessibility allows our site or product to be available to more people. And a lot of times, sites are used by companies or Um, I mean, even for personal use, you want your site to be seen. You're not just putting it on the internet to just be there, but you want people to see it and interact with it. So this helps you to reach more people. Web accessibility helps us remove barriers for people with disabilities. Um, with with the internet and web use being such like an essential part of our society now, and it's kind of become a staple for workplaces as well, at least in the technology industry. But it's it's important that people who have those disabilities are still able to access the web and use it, uh, whether it be for personal reasons or for work or whatever it is. It's very important, and it's a big part of our society now. It helps us to create higher quality and a more usable site in general. So, no one wants to have a site that's super complicated to use, even if you aren't disabled. It still can be make it difficult and cumbersome to use a site if it's got like too many options, or maybe the text is hard to read. I mean, that affects all of us. So it's good in general to make an accessible site. All right, so what are some of the disabilities that affect web access? And I think it's important for us to understand this because we need to know who kind of our audience, if you will, that we're trying to help out with this accessibility. So we need to keep them in mind as we design. So people with auditory disabilities, so people who are deaf or maybe hard of hearing, um, people who have cognitive disabilities. So if you have autism or dyslexia, is a couple examples of that. Um, like any really, I guess, learning disability that can make it difficult for you to understand what's going on in the site. Neurological, ADD, learning disabilities, um, physical disabilities, so things that can make it hard to interact with the site. Um, and then speech disabilities, if your site has a lot of maybe auditory, like you have to talk to it to interact with it, that's usually not a good design because it limits people with speech disabilities. Visual disabilities is a pretty big one. People with blindness or poor eyesight, or even people who are colorblind is a big one. You want to make sure your site has alternatives for people who may not be able to read what's on there, or making it so that the text can be large enough or that the colors are make it easy to read what's on the site. Um, and I think a lot of these kind of they kind of tie into each other. So just keeping these different disabilities in mind can help us with our designs. So does web accessibility help those who are not disabled? Yeah, absolutely it does. Um, one of the big ones, people are on smaller screens. I mean, most of the web browsing I do is on mobile. And if a site doesn't have a mobile site, then it's a huge pain to use. And so I mean, that helps out with accessibility a ton. Older people, you want to make sure that you design the site so it can be used by people who are aging. I mean, as we get older, our eyesight starts to go, so does our hearing, and different things happen. And so you want to make sure that they're able to use the site as well. So people who are temporarily disabled. So that would mean that kind of goes hand in hand with physical disabilities. Maybe you have like a broken arm or something like that, or you're injured in some way. You want to make sure the site is still accessible to those people because, just because you have a broken arm or something like that, doesn't mean you're going to be you're not going to be able to work or something like that. So you want to make sure your sites are accessible to those people. People who are in environments that they can't access certain parts of the site. This is a pretty big one. I run into this commonly. I guess a good example of this would be like YouTube. They allow for captions or subtitles on videos. So if you have like say you're in a classroom or in a public space where you don't want to just play your video out loud or something like that, or maybe you're trying to, well, I guess if you have like an audio book, I guess you could just read the book, but I guess that's part of the site design. You got to be able to actually read the book. So having alternative options, and this goes with like people with maybe like visual disabilities as well, or even people who are hearing impaired. You got to have alternatives for those things so that people can still access parts of your site. And then those with slow internet connection. I know I experience this one sometimes. Sometimes the sites will be kind of like too heavy for me to load. I live kind of out in the country, so my internet is not always the greatest. So that's important for a lot of people. I mean, there's people who don't have great internet access, and so you want to make sure your site is lightweight enough to allow for those people to access it. All right, so I've kind of touched on this a little bit in explaining those past slides, but I'm going to go into more depth here. So how do we make our sites more accessible? A good place to start is the the standards for this class. There's plenty of accessibility standards there. Actually, most of these that I've mentioned here and listed out are mentioned on that page. And so I'll just show you the page real quick. Okay, yeah, so this is the page. Hopefully we're all familiar with this. It's usually linked, I think, at the bottom of every assignment, or you can find it in the modules. I think the link's like at the bottom. But yeah, this has some great stuff on it, and I'll kind of go over some of this in the slides. In the slide. So one of the things that's mentioned there, W3C standards, and there's links on this page for these validators. So what I would say is just put your code in the validators and it'll check it for you. You don't have to go searching for the standards or anything. I mean you can if you want, but these validators are super helpful tools when it comes to accessibility. WCAG standards. So they have kind of an acronym that they use to help you kind of remember like what you should be designing towards. So it's called POUR. So you want to make sure your site is perceivable, so people who maybe have different disabilities can still perceive the site. So whether that's by listening to it or seeing it, however it is, it's operable. so people with different disabilities can use the site. So if maybe you can't see what you're doing, you could talk to the site to interact with it. Understandable, it's easily understandable. I mean, that's a pretty straightforward one right there. And then robust, this one kind of goes hand in hand with understandable. You want to make sure your design is robust. So it covers a lot of problems that people might have with the site. You want to make sure it's well laid out and not going to cause too many issues. So making multimedia with text alternatives. This is a practice that hopefully we all do, using alt for images is an example of this. So writing out a text description for people who can't actually see the image is a good way to fulfill this. Or same thing with videos with captions, that kind of stuff. Make sure that the site is mobile accessible, responsive design. Yeah, I mean, this is something that we have hopefully been doing and practicing. Use the correct element or HTML elements for the correct purposes. This one is important as well, and hopefully we're doing this one too. I know for me it can be kind of confusing sometimes, but just trying not to use, like, say, a paragraph element for in place of like a main or something like that. Just try to be reasonable with your selection of elements. Okay, try to simplify content of the site to help with ease of use. Yeah, you don't want your site to be too cluttered. You want people to be able to navigate it easily, and that just helps out everyone. Using colors with other colors that provide high contrast. So a big one with this one is probably keeping color blindness in mind. Because like you don't want to use something like, I know red-green color blindness is pretty common. Or well, not common, but as far as colorblind goes. So maybe you don't want to, use red on top of green, for example. But just keeping that in mind when you're designing. Something that I kind of like to do, and this is just a personal thing, but I like to use like a neutral color on a colored background. I'll kind of rarely put a color with text, at least put a color on top of another color, because it can provide, I mean, you never know, like if someone has some visual disability that could limit them from reading that text. Oh, and then this is linked in the standards. Great tool. Oh wait, maybe is this one? Oh, maybe this one isn't actually. Yeah, so this one right here, this is just a contrast checker. So you could just put in the hexadecimal codes, or actually you can go here and you can put in the RGB code as well. And then it'll give you the WCAG standard. So depending on the text sizes, yeah, it just gives you different information here on how accessible your site is. And this actually, I mean, I've seen it in my internship. We do web apps, so I've seen this used actually and mentioned pretty often. So it's a good thing to use, a good tool. All right, let's see, make sure the page isn't too heavy. This page speed tester, you can find it in here. Great tool. Just make sure the page isn't too heavy for those people with slower internet. So, okay. All right, and then here's a couple examples. And I'll try and go through these pretty quickly here. All right, so let's see here. So this one is the HTML example. So just some HTML code applying those accessibility standards I just mentioned. So we could kind of see here, I used header tags for a header, main for main, footer for a footer. In here, I put an alt, I guess, I don't know if you call it a tag or what it would be, but can't remember what the term is. But I used an alt, so I have some text here for the picture if people can't see that picture. Use the list here, pretty standard stuff you should all be familiar with. Created a paragraph element for a paragraph. So yeah, it's pretty simple, I feel like, when it comes to HTML. Just try and use your best judgment when it comes to the elements that you're using, and remember to add text to your images. All right, so CSS. Here we've got kind of an example. This is kind of a desktop example and then a mobile example of the same page. So you could probably tell here there's some responsive design going on here. So I have a media query for that image. And that just makes it so you can actually see the image. You can see the width. I set it to 1,000 pixels. So on a mobile, you'd probably see about half this if we didn't do that. So that's an important aspect there. I also made the headers, the main or the fonts for the headers and the main and the footer. I made them larger, just to kind of show like this is maybe how we would do it if we were designing, something to be accessible for someone who had a hard time reading smaller text, maybe. And then here I checked this with that color checker I showed you guys. We've got, and like I said, I like to use just neutral colors on like a colored background or vice versa. So yeah, I just put some black on here. And then you just use this kind of like beige color for the background. And yeah, the color checker came back and told me that this was, the contrast was good. So yeah, so pretty simple stuff there. All right, and then here's my resources, and you guys can go check these out in the PowerPoint. I think you'll have access to that. This first one here is just going to be the W3C site, and it's going to have some information about kind of accessibility standards. This is also a good resource right here. This is Mozilla's developer pages, and it's got some info on web accessibility. You can find that on the standards for the class. You can find that there too. There's a link to it in there. And then, oh yeah, this is just that picture of the old man I used. Just wanted to make sure I had that resource. And that's my presentation. Thanks, everyone.